Hello, friends. Welcome to today's episode of Tracy Schott's Voices for Change show, the series dedicated to putting an end to intimate partner violence. I'm Hope Katz-Gibbs, producer of the show and Tracy's publicist, honored to be that. And you are listening to this on Facebook Live today and then on Incandescent Radio at incandescent.tv. We are thrilled to introduce you to today's guest, Dr. David Adams, the co-founder of Emerge, which is the first counseling program in the nation for men who abuse women. Fascinating. He has led groups of abusers for 40 years and parenting education groups for almost 20. He's also one of the nation's leading experts on abusers and abuser interventions. His book, Why Do They Kill, was published in 2007. I, for one, can't wait to hear this conversation. So throwing it over to Tracy.
Thanks, Hope. And thanks, David, Dr. Adams, for joining us. I met Dr. Adams through his book. I was doing research for Finding Jen's Voice, a documentary film about intimate partner homicide, and I came across this pretty gruesome title called "Why Do They Kill?" and I was trying to figure that out. Why do they kill? So I read your book, David, and then we were in contact shortly after that, and we ended up interviewing you for the film. And then you and I ran and crossed paths again a couple of years ago at the Conference on Crimes Against Women, and it's been a fun, and I'm excited to be collaborating with you on this podcast and our upcoming webinar this week. So yeah, it's you took on a population of clients that a lot of people kind of shied away from, particularly at the time that you did this. So you've got an interesting story. I kind of want to, what got you into here? Tell us about yourself. Tell us how you ended up working in this field of intimate partner violence. Tell us about you.
Oh, sure. Well, I grew up in Vermont, and I grew up in a home where my father was abusive to my mother and to myself and my three siblings. My mother ended up dying at age 42 of heart failure, but my siblings and I all believe that a very strong contributing factor to her death was my father's abusive behavior towards her that included denial of medical care. And so I was 17 when my mother died, and that was in 1971, where really the term domestic violence hadn't even been invented yet. I mean, my mother died not knowing that she was a battered woman. I figure out she would have had to have lived another 3 years to have discovered that, because her only exposure to the outside world was daytime television. And the only thing on daytime television, besides the soap operas, were the talk shows. And it would have been Phil Donahue who would have introduced my mother to domestic violence, because he had battered women on his show in 1974. And so that would have possibly have introduced my mother to the idea that she was in an abusive relationship. And so the story I like to tell is that it was my grandmother, who I adored, my mother's mother, who had this key role in my development. And she would come and visit twice a year. And we loved it. It was like Christmas time when she visited. And she would take us on all these outings that we otherwise would not be able to go on, to, rent lakeside cottages for us and take us to a zoo and so forth. My father hated her.
Of course.
She hated my father because she knew how he was treating her daughter. And she did this very strange thing when I was 5 years old, which made no sense at the time, but over time, I've kind of figured it out, how clever this was. What she did was she took me to my father's workplace. And my father's workplace was the granite quarries of Vermont. And so we walked up to the edge of a quarry, and we were looking down at the bottom of this quarry, and the workers looked like little dots at the bottom of the quarry. And she pointed to one of the dots and she said, "That's your daddy down there." And I said, "That's not my daddy. He's bigger than that." But it ended up being this revelation because it had never occurred to me that in the larger scheme of things, my father was really quite tiny.
Right.
And so that was really helpful to a 5-year-old, because if my father was so tiny that he didn't have to be so powerful, and I didn't have to be like him, because size matters to a 5-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And so it introduced me to the idea that there was a bigger world, and my father wasn't the only influence in the world. And so I kind of started this list of ways to be different from my father at age 5. And the ways to be different kind of grew over the years, but the most obvious way to be different from my father was to be educated, because my father was a 5th grade dropout.
Right.
And so I became a very good student. I never missed a day of school, K through 12,
Wow.
which is very embarrassing because you have like these school assemblies where they honor you. I was the only boy 4 years in a row that didn't miss a day of school. But because I was a good student, it kind of put me under the influence of teachers and coaches. I was a good athlete. And so I had different role models, and so that really kind of saved me. My
Wow.
sisters always remember that I was walking around with my face in a book. I was reading up about other families. When I had girlfriends, I was practically living at their houses, soaking up the energy of what I saw as normal, healthy families, right? And so kind of like, unfortunately, my sisters and my brother more or less followed in my father's footsteps and
Oh.
kind of became like him. And so my kind of survival strategy, so to speak, was really kind of to have this experience of needing to be different from my father and being influenced by other people in my life, basically. Yeah.
Wow, that's a really powerful story, and I wonder, is that a story that you share with the perpetrators or the men that you work with?
I've never shared that. I very occasionally I've talked about different aspects of my father when I've wanted to illustrate different aspect of parenting, for instance, or bad parenting, I should say.
Right.
But shaming. My father was a big shamer, for instance. So we'll talk about different ways that he might have shamed me or so forth. Yeah.
I think the powerful takeaway that I heard, and I think about my husband and how he tries to be like a role model for his sons and how important that is to him. I would think that it would be powerful to hear that, do you want your children to want to be like you
Mhm.
or not? Or do you want them to feel like they want to be the opposite of you? I mean, that's to me that would be might be a motivator for people. I think that most parents kind of intuitively you want you're kind of proud when your kids want to be like you because that feels good, right? Um,
Well,
and
I think my father didn't. I mean, my father was more of a macho man. He was a deer hunter, for instance. I hated the whole aspect of killing animals, but he would basically require me to come along with him and to help him to clean the deer that he'd killed. And so I kind of grew up feeling like I was overly sensitive in some ways. And my father definitely would throw that in my face, that basically say, "You're too much like a girl." And so later on, I came to recognize that not as a liability, but as a strength, right? Because the teachers and coaches and other adults in my life began to really appreciate that I was sensitive and in a way that was insightful, right? And that was caring, towards other people. And so what I had seen as a deficit with my father and was really kind of ashamed of,
yeah.
I came to see as a strength.
How wonderful that you had those positive role models to pull you through. So fast forward, you're a psychologist, and you find yourself, I believe you were on the board of Transition House, is that correct? Before Emerge started? How did you get into this field?
Well, I was, so Emerge was established by 10 men. I was the youngest of the 10 men. There were mostly, I think 5 of us were social workers. There was one taxi driver. There was one construction worker. What we all had in common was that we were friends of women who had started Transition House and Casa Myrna Vesquez and Respond, 3 of the early so-called battered women's programs of the 70s, and so they had been getting calls on their hotline from men, and they didn't really feel it was their job to work with abusers, and yet they still feel that there should be some help available for abusers, and so they asked us as a group of men that they knew and more or less trusted whether we would be interested in taking this on. And so our first meeting was in my apartment in Dorchester, Massachusetts. I remember one of the earliest activities was to listen to this audio tape. And because there was nothing written about domestic violence, the only way to learn about the issue was to talk to battered women, basically. And so we started inviting battered women to come and to share their stories with us. And so one of the women actually convinced her estranged abusive husband to send an audio tape to us. And so we sat around listening to this 90-minute audio tape. And it was kind of a revelation because, he initially was kind of apologizing because he clearly wanted her back, right? But then he kind of went on to kind of almost like romanticizing his abusive behavior and making excuses for his abusive behavior and rationalizing it. And so it kind of was eye-opening because we thought, we were very naive. We thought, well, we'll just tell them it's wrong, basically.
Seems simple enough, right?
And so then it just said, oh my God, this is really a lot more complicated because there's excuses, there's rationalizations, there's blaming the victim, and so forth. And so then we began to kind of construct an intervention that really kind of fit those kind of points of resistance, so to speak.
Right. And we're going to actually have a webinar this Thursday, and I'm actually going to show our audience a link to that so people can see that. 1 second here. So yeah, this will be happening on Thursday afternoon, same time at 1 o'clock, and it will be on Facebook Live at Finding Jen's Voice Facebook page, but you can also register for it to get the YouTube link. And we're going to have David on the webinar, as well as his colleague Susan from Emerge, and 2 people from the director and assistant director, Sarah and Ronit, from Transition House, which is a domestic abuse shelter and a program for survivors of domestic violence that you work very closely with. So we're excited to kind of dive more deeply into what makes that program work and the importance of your work with Transition House and working directly with survivors. So, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed when I've talked to various organizations through the years, it seems like frequently it's like there's the survivor camp here and the perpetrator camp there, and that's absolutely not how you guys work. You're very survivor focused in your work. So talk to me a little bit about some of the elements of kind of what you've learned about abusers, particularly those who kill. You did this study, and an examination of men who had been incarcerated for murdering their intimate partners. Talk to us a little bit about that work and what that was like for you to kind of go down that dark road.
Well, I mean, I wrote the book because I was curious about what is the extreme of domestic violence. Because clearly, that's the extreme, and that's less than 0.2% of of those who abuse their intimate partners. But I think that there's a continuum there. There's a continuum of severity. There's a continuum of degree of possessiveness. And so I was curious, and I wanted to find out directly from those who had killed their partners. And I also, as part of my book, was interviewing women who had been victims of attempted homicide too, because I wanted them to kind of be stand-ins for murder victims, so to speak, to give their perspective. And from that, I was able to construct these 5 different typologies of killers that all have somewhat different motivations to kill their intimate partners. Some of them, for instance, are possessively jealous, and so there's a kind of an obvious kind of motivation there. Usually it's post-separation. Usually post-separation, they begin to sort of step up their level of surveillance and monitoring. Some of them actually even quit their jobs or were fired from their jobs in order to have more time to stalk their victims. And so then you have murder suicides, and so quite often there's a kind of a history of depression and despondency coupled with possessive control as well. But I think that you have a lot of isolation in those cases. You have the stigma of a mental illness, I mean, one of the killers I interviewed was speaking to me through a voice box, because after stabbing his wife to death, he had stabbed himself in the throat and had lost his ability to speak at that point. So that in that particular case, his wife had waited for the 2 children to graduate from high school before leaving him, because she had spent 18 years trying to get him back into treatment, trying to get him back on medications, because he was so severely depressed, and then she made the plan to leave when, and she was in fact leaving him the day that he stabbed her to death.
Did you find that that was the case with the majority of the men you interviewed, that the murders happened after she left?
Well, either after she left or having made plans to leave, too. So estrangement, basically, or planned estrangement. Yeah. And so that's why it's so important in working with abusers, because most of the abusers that we work with that emerge, many of them have partners who have left them or are thinking about leaving them or have gotten a restraining order. And so it kind of behooves us to really speak to them about that loss or that pending loss in their lives. And so how is it that they can adjust to that new reality in their lives, right? For instance, we like to point out that they still have their children to think about, right? Which is a very strong motivating factor for many of them. It doesn't mean the relationship is over even, right? Because most victims we've discovered, they don't necessarily want to end the relationship. They more want for him to change. And so they're desperate, when they come to us. And so we have a wealth of information for them about what is it that you can do that can help to restore trust with your partner, right? I mean, what is it that you can do that can help her feel that you are somebody that she wants to be with, actually,
Right.
It's not a liability in her life. It's not a drag on her independence, that's not somebody who, that means her harm or resents her, that actually celebrates her strength, that appreciates, what she gives, to you, to the relationship, what she gives, in general. And so that's the heartening thing for us to see, for some of the men at least, the transition to a place of really respecting, their partner, and stepping up to be better role models for their children.
I've spoken with a lot of people who work with victims, survivors of intimate partner violence, and there's frequently this just kind of hopelessness of they've just kind of written off perpetrators, that they're narcissists. They can't be treated. They're done. And it's clear to me that given the numbers of women who are abused and how many perpetrators there are, it's really a faulty thinking to think that we're going to just give up on this whole segment of the population who, like you, had, many of whom grew up with that kind of a role model of a parent and didn't choose to emulate, somebody else. So I think that the work you're doing is so important. But there's, how many programs are out there these days? I know that you guys were the first. I know that you do training and do a lot of duplication, try to help other people duplicate the program that you've put together. What's the prognosis? How are we doing getting there?
Well, our outcomes are actually fairly positive. So we participated in the study that was commissioned by our probation department. And so we basically turned over the data for all of the people who started the program over 2 years and then followed them for 2 years. And the results were actually quite good. So 11%, 11.6% of the program completers had reoffended.
Okay.
And 20% overall, so those are two good numbers.
Yeah.
And so that sort of fit it was validating because it also sort of fit the what we'd learned from partners. And so we do have very extensive contact. We call it partner contact with the partners. And, for the most part, what we learn is that, particularly over time, there are a lot of people who drop out, at the beginning stages. And so the outcomes are predictable there that they will reoffend. But those who stay with it, people who stay with the program, and we have quite a number of people who voluntarily extend themselves in the program, they do well. They develop, respect for their partners, empathy. We hear it directly from the partners. We hear them say things like, he shows interest in my life. He notices my feelings. He notices when I'm tired. He notices when I'm anxious. And that's sort of, previously it was more like, what the hell's your problem?
Right.
Kind of like always seeing her as a source of irritation, or frustration, and blaming her for problems. And so part of what we do is how to self-manage, how to take care of your own feelings. So women shouldn't be your emotional caretakers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what a setup that is, right?
Yeah, can't win.
The partner to be responsible for your emotions, right? So if I'm unhappy, you're to blame,
Right.
right? And so, we like to point out that when there's a separation in a relationship, there's an opportunity for you to learn how to manage your feelings, your anxiety, your boredom, your depression, without making somebody else responsible, so that you're, and hopefully in doing that, you're putting yourself in a much better position to have a relationship, right? Where you can actually give something to another person rather than take something, take things, right?
What I think that it's an incredible way of just thinking about abuse, and that it's fundamentally about not taking responsibility for your own feelings, and not really knowing how to manage your own feelings. So I think that you paint a hopeful picture, but I hear a prevention picture in there too, which is how do we start training boys so that they don't grow up to be men who don't know how to deal with their own feelings. Like, if you were to tell, I'm throwing this at you at left field, I apologize, but if you were to talk to a teacher or a parent of young boys, what would be the main things you would tell us that we need to teach boys about managing their own feelings? What do they need to hear?
Well, I mean, I think that boys are, you know, complicated, I mean, I think that we kind of tend to sort of stereotype boys, and to kind of steer them towards being athletes, or, thinking about their careers, and we don't sort of have the same expectations that we have of girls. Girls are kind of expected to be caretakers, to express interest and to show interest in other people. Boys are clearly able to do that. It's just that we don't expect that of them, right? And so I like to point out that the job description for men has changed, over the years. It used to be that men were just expected to be financial providers, basically. And anything else that they gave was kind of a bonus, right? And I still think that we're struggling with that. So even though that's based on kind of an old model where the husband was working outside the home and the wife was working in the home, I think, there's still, a lot of men who haven't gotten that memo, right?
Yeah.
That they basically kind of expect that they should be rewarded, and appreciated for being a financial provider. And they don't have expectations themselves to be nurturers, and so as a result, they don't learn how to soothe the crying child, right? But what is kind of encouraging is that when men start spending dedicated time with kids, post divorce, for instance, it I think motivates them, to notice things that they otherwise, if they've depended previously on the other partner, the other parent, to soothe the crying child, right, or to remember the birthdays, and schedule the appointments. All of a sudden, they have to develop these new skills, right, and so they can actually become quite good at it, right, and I think it motivates them in a different way, that my child needs me to notice them. Daddy, look what I drew today. Daddy, look what I did today. And who can not be affected by that? I mean, who can not, be motivated by that, right? There's a responsibility there, right? To help this little being feel good about themselves, right?
Well, there's a hopefulness that comes from the work that you're doing. And a lot of people would burn out after 20 years of doing the work that you're doing, and you've done it more than twice that. What keeps you going?
Well, I mean, two things. One is that it's very meaningful to me, I mean, having these conversations with men that they otherwise would not have, because men say that all the time. They say, "Oh my God, I can't believe I've never had conversations like this before about relationships," right? And so every time I do a group, I walk away feeling really fortunate to have started these conversations with men, right? And so that's deeply meaningful to me. I wish my father had that experience. And the other thing is that, the credibility. So doing this work has given me credibility to influence the system, and so I'm every day, is a different day, but it involves training of police officers, of judges, of child welfare workers, and so changing how institutions respond to domestic violence, that also is very meaningful, and that keeps me going. Because I wouldn't be doing it if it was just working with individual abusers, because I feel like it's even more important because every abuser is surrounded by kind of systems of complicity, right? And so it's very, very important for us to kind of work at the root causes of this problem, right? And so we do a lot of that in conjunction with transition health, so that also is meaningful to me. And then just to be able to get away from it, sometimes too, because it is very heavy work. I've developed hobbies over the years. I've become a stand-up comedian, as a kind of a sideline. And so just to be able to sort of like see the humor in situations, and that sort of keeps it
Certainly, a sense of humor goes a long way in helping us just get a little equilibrium in life, right? It's awesome. One more personal question, and that is your dad still living?
No, my father died 2 years ago. And so I kind of spent 5 years visiting him once a month at a nursing home. It was very painful because my father never really changed. He was still a bully. He would still bully my sister, who took care of him and like literally sacrificed her life for him, and so, part of my survival strategy was to kind of like try to get through every visit by just distracting him. I'd end up preparing all these YouTube videos of guilty dogs to show my father. My father would be kind of lying on his bed at this nursing home because he lost both of his legs due to diabetes. I'd be holding my iPad up to him, showing these guilty dogs, and then watching my watch to count off the hour, just to get through that visit. And then on the way back, just to celebrate, that I've survived another visit, I would stop off at a restaurant, a 99 restaurant, and have exactly the same meal, barbecued turkey tips with mashed potato and slaw, just as a kind of a little self-nurturing ritual, for myself. So I did that for 5 years.
Wow. What did he think about what you were doing?
He didn't connect it. I mean, my father still continued to sort of see himself as a victim, and so that was very painful to me. I would have been able to I would have been happy to have had a better relationship with him if he had kind of taken some responsibility, basically. That was not the case for my father. But there are other men I could work with, right?
Right. Right. And so you've taken that experience and helped so many men and women over the years. I spoke with one of the women who's going to be on our panel was a survivor of domestic violence many years ago, who you worked with her husband for a time, and you talked to her directly, and she credits you with saving her life. And I know how the work is really, really hard, but I think ultimately everybody who's in it, it is about saving lives. And so thank you. Thank you for the lives you've saved and transformed, and the impact you're having on society, which is incredible. It's really important. So I'm really looking forward to our webinar on Thursday, and I invite everybody who's watching to join us. So thanks again, David, for being here.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Hope. Take it away.
Wow. Such an amazing conversation, David. I feel it in my heart. I'm sorry for that experience you had, but how amazing that you turned it around like this. So we're all grateful for that. I think any child who's had a challenging father can relate a little bit to what you were saying. But that you're changing men, and as the mother of a son, and I'm grateful for that, just so that they can open up and be brave. I think that that's what this is all about, just that courage to stand up and take control of your life in whatever way that is necessary. So what I would love to do is share the 5 types of killers on this in the liner notes. And of course, we'll link to this fantastic webinar that's coming up on Thursday, July 29th. All of Tracy's webinars are fantastic and all of her guests are so illuminating. So thank you, David Adams. Thank you, amazing Tracy Schott. I'm Hope Katz-Gibbs with Incandescent Radio and Incandescent TV. We will bring you another episode in a couple of weeks. Tracy, tell us about our upcoming guests in August.
Who's next? Janice.
Janice.
Janice Farabee is our next guest, and she is a fellow social worker, David, who is who has created programs for young Black women and girls to help them with their self-esteem. She at one point worked in fashion, worked for 17 magazine, and really started to understand how our societal views of Black women and girls was really impacting their self-esteem in so many negative ways. So she's going to be joining us, telling us more about her journey and the work that she's been doing. So looking forward to having Janice with us.
Absolutely. And the other guests that we will have on this show and others. So thank you again, everybody. We'll see you soon on the next episode of Voices4Change.tv. Bye.